Good evening, everyone. Hi, I'm Catherine Heinz with New York City Audubon, and welcome to the first lecture, really, of our 2021-2022 season of fall and winter lectures on the topic of birds, bird conservation, and environmental conservation in New York City. And I am, I think as a few people are still coming into the chat, I am just thrilled to welcome you tonight, and I'm so pleased at the enthusiasm for this program. We are here to offer you a presentation on the Wetlands Management Framework for New York City, which was developed by New York City Parks and the Natural Areas Conservancy together. And it is a way forward for wetland restoration, maintenance, and protection in the city, and a roadmap for other urban areas as well. But I'm really particularly thrilled that it's here. I learned about this in the spring when it came out, and I reached out immediately to Sarah and said, oh my goodness, every member of New York City Audubon needs to know about this, needs to know about the Natural Areas Conservancy if they don't already know. And so we began to plot a way to present this for all of you. And many, many years ago, New York City Audubon did all of the heavy lifting in the area of urban conservation for habitat for birds, and which is also good for people. And what happened around about 2012, when the Natural Areas Conservancy was created, is they took on that heavy lift. And they are doing just absolutely amazing work. So I am pleased to bring you the New York City Wetlands Framework, Wetlands Management Framework, and Sarah Charlop-Powers, who's the Executive Director of the Natural Areas Conservancy, Marit Larson, who is the Chief of the Natural Resources Group of New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, and Mike Feller, who is the former Chief Naturalist for the New York City Parks, and also is a member of New York City Audubon's Conservation Committee and a fan of ours for many years. And I have to say the feeling's quite mutual. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah and Marit to introduce us to the framework.
Thank you so much, Catherine. It's really a pleasure to be here. I've appreciated the scheming over the last several months, but I'm excited that we've arrived at this evening's program. I am going to screen share, and I will kind of kick off a brief sort of orientation presentation that I'll give in collaboration with Marit. And we will introduce you to a little bit of context about wetlands in New York City, and then give a high-level overview of the sort of themes and recommendations of the Wetland Management Framework. And then we're really excited to move into a discussion with our longtime colleague, Mike and Catherine, to really kind of dig in on some exciting information on this topic and to answer questions from the audience. So I'm going to start by just setting the stage a little bit. As Catherine said, my name is Sarah Charlop-Powers. I am the co-founder and the executive director of the Natural Areas Conservancy, and I'm joined for this presentation portion of tonight's program by my colleague Marit Larson, who is the Chief of Natural Resources at New York City Parks. In order to give a little bit of context about the framework, thought it might be helpful to give a little bit of background about the Natural Areas Conservancy as an organization. The Natural Areas Conservancy was launched in June of 2012, just a couple of months before Superstorm Sandy hit, which I think sort of features prominently in our story and some of the recommendations that we're going to cover this evening. At the time that we were founded, we were sort of a newest addition to a long legacy of public-private partnership that really kicked off with the formation of the Central Park Conservancy back in the late 1970s. And we function as an independent nonprofit that works under a formal management agreement with the Parks Department, conducting scientific research, creating policies and recommendations, and implementing restoration projects in natural habitat across the city. Unlike most of our conservancy partners, we work across more than 20,000 acres of parkland distributed across more than 50 parks, rather than in a single park, but we very much exist to advance the agency's mission of caring for the third of the city parkland that is natural areas. So I'll give us a little bit of background to kind of kick us off. I love starting presentations with this image, which is a rendering from the book Mannahatta by Dr. Eric Sanderson at the Wildlife Conservation Society. This image looks from the southern tip of Manhattan north towards the Bronx. On the right side of the screen, you can see the edges of Long Island, so Brooklyn and Queens, and New Jersey off to your left. And as we talk about wetlands and natural spaces today, I find it helpful to remember that the especially large remnant natural areas that exist within our city are these kind of these really sort of triumphant remains of a natural landscape that used to span our entire city landscape. So you can see in this image, we have this interesting patchwork of forests and wetlands in what our sort of historic landscape looked like. And that will sort of tie into some of the recommendations about caring for wetlands today and into the future. I'm going to give just a very brief kind of visual tour of some of the large wetland complexes within New York City that are on City Parks property. It's surprising to many people, including a lot of folks that we've worked with for many years, just how diverse and how sort of far-flung our city's wetland resources are. So this first image is in the Sawmill Creek in Staten Island. This is Pugsley Creek in the Bronx. This is a great egret. I wanted to give the bird folks a little shout out. This is in Strack Pond in Forest Park in Central Queens. Calcutta Pond in Staten Island, Hunter Island in Pelham Bay Park in the Bronx, West Pond, which is down in the Jamaica Bay region. These two images, this one and this next one, are from a citizen science effort to monitor horseshoe crabs in Coney Island Creek. And this image is taken in Bayswater Park. You can see the control tower for the airport in the background. So as I mentioned, the wetlands that we're going to talk about today are remnants of this really large set of historical wetland complexes. At present, we have lost 85% of our city's historic salt marshes and 99% of our historic freshwater wetlands, which really lends urgency to the messages we're going to share about the critical need to invest in the protection and restoration of the wetlands that remain within the 5 boroughs. Just to give a little bit of a sense of kind of the full landscape of our wetland systems, we have a little over 6,000 acres of wetlands currently across the city. We have 2,390 acres of wetlands, which are on New York City parkland. So New York City Parks is the single largest manager of wetlands within New York City, and the recommendations in the Wetland Management Framework are really targeted at the long-term care and expansion of that portfolio. So before I hand things off to Mara to really dive into the details of the Wetland Management Framework, I'll just say that back in 2018, the Natural Areas Conservancy and the Parks Department collaborated to release the Forest Management Framework for New York City, which laid out a 25-year roadmap for the restoration and management of over 7,000 acres of forested natural area habitat. It really drew on a lot of new primary and then historic research about the condition and distribution of those resources, and laid out a really comprehensive roadmap for the investment and staffing needed to care for the city's forests. This wetland management framework really serves as a companion plan to that first framework. Together, they provide a really comprehensive vision for the majority of natural areas under the Parks Department's management, and touch on and provide guidance for critical issues related to resilience and habitat protection of this really important resource. So with that, I'll hand it off to Mara to kind of dive us into the details of the plan.
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you for having us, Catherine, and the sort of honor of presenting to your group, and those who are participants in Audubon is really significant. We know how much work you've done going back to the 20, 30 years, and I'll just preface this relatively quick overview of the Wetlands Management Framework with that, since this work really builds on a lot of really significant work that has been done to protect wetlands over the decades in New York. And one of the things we wanted to try to accomplish with this framework was, as Sarah said, kind of an overview to provide context and a roadmap at what we think is a pivotal point where there are new threats and risks that are perhaps not as apparent or weren't as apparent 10 years ago. So we also have the challenge in this framework and in our approach to managing wetlands that we don't own all of the land that really needs to be taken care of and managed in order to protect these systems. And so it is arguably even more complex than managing our forested systems. So we try to do a lot in this framework, and I will start now with a bit of an overview for what we try to accomplish. So the next slide starts us off with the risks, with the values and ecosystem services that we want to emphasize for the reader of this framework, and the audience being quite broad often includes our elected officials. So as all of you know who are here tonight, wetlands are critical resources in helping to absorb storm flows, to help mitigate impacts of storms and coastal flooding, as well as inland flooding. They're critical for providing habitat for a huge number of bird species across the city and maintaining, helping to protect our biodiversity. They're critical for water quality protection and enhancement throughout the landscape, as well as along the coast. And they, of course, also have intrinsic value and value for humans, just as a beautiful open space where you can, of course, recreate both actively and passively. And increasingly, I think we've recognized the importance of wetlands for our mental health and their beauty. So although you can go to the next slide, we've come to appreciate wetlands and have a lot of rigorous protections in place as a result of the Clean Water Act and some efforts within the city. We've still got a substantial risks and threats facing our wetlands. So the actions that we've taken, the investments that we've made as a city with partners to restore hundreds of acres of wetlands are really substantial, but we've got new risks associated with climate change in particular. The most obvious on the coast being sea level rise and the fact that our disturbed sediment regimes and the accelerated rise, particularly in our region where we have, glacial histories that result in even more accelerated sea level rise are continue to be a threat. We've got the ongoing, although abated, but continued risk of fragmentation of our wetlands in particular, and filling in small incremental places where we don't have sufficient protection, and continued threats due to stormwater runoff, both the increased frequency and contamination and volume associated with stormwater in our highly developed, largely impervious urban landscape, as well as pollution and debris and threats from invasive species, particularly in throughout our wetlands and streams. So our next slide shows kind of a really compact summary of how we've looked at what our conditions, the conditions of our wetlands and streams are across the city to date. This is a culmination of coming close to 10 years of work to really evaluate what kind of ecological health we've got across our landscapes, both in our stream systems throughout the city, as well as in our freshwater wetlands and salt marshes. So these colors represent streams, salt marshes, and freshwater wetlands. And each dot is a site where we've collected data on the ground in order to come up with metrics that we've used to sort of score or rank the condition of these sites relative to one another with respect to their ecological health, as well as with respect to the vulnerability or threat that they experience. So what we did with this matrix is use it as kind of a conceptual model to be able to identify where we have areas of high health and it's a really good conditions and sort of the least vulnerability, areas that we need to protect. And that's what the circle shows up in the upper corner of the slide, to the other extreme sites where we have a very low health, really highly impacted and highly threatened sites. And those will tend to be sites where we need to take extreme action and intervene if we're going to restore conditions there. And then a large swath of sites across the 1,000 acres of wetlands that we've monitored that we need to manage in different ways. So with this approach that we've taken to kind of categorizing our conditions for wetlands across the city, we've identified the kinds of actions, the sort of tools in our toolbox for management, whether it's protection management or restoration. So the next slides show that what these recommendations are across the city. For all sites, we know that it's really important to engage communities and to allow access to these sites and increase people's understanding and comfort and appreciation. So we do that with stewardship programs, and we do that in all of our wetland types. And we know we need to do and would love to do more of that. We also know that monitoring continues to be important so that we can both assess our progress, but also identify what kind of threats we might be facing that we haven't perceived before. So the recommendations, the next slide here summarizes a lot of work that's happened across the city that represent on the ground actions that we need to take across all of our wetland types. So in particularly in the upland, we need to manage stormwater along our streams and freshwater wetlands, as well as our salt marshes. We need to manage invasives and care for the buffers around these systems. We need to remove trash and debris, of course. It's New York, everywhere. And then particularly the bottom pictures represent work, on the ground work that's often focused on salt marshes. Removing historic fill, that's one of the things that we've done the most to date. And the new actions that we are piloting in New York and might be doing more and more of have to do with raising the elevation of salt marshes and addressing problems related to increased vulnerability due to sea level rise and due to sediment disruption and erosion on our shorelines, where we're continuing to lose ground. So these actions represent in the management framework, they're sort of laid out, but we also have a map that shows that we have hundreds of locations across the city where these actions are kind of prioritized, and we have an associated database of opportunities that we've drawn when we get opportunities to do restoration. In the Wetlands Management Framework, we've identified some of our top priorities. So in addition to on-the-ground actions, the next slide highlights something that the Audubon is certainly familiar with, the effort to protect more open space for habitat and for in particular on the coastline, marshes to migrate. So we've done this for decades, but it's increasingly urgent with competition for space that we identify sites that are high priority for acquisition, and we try to work with our agency partners to streamline the process for doing that, for both acquiring property where it's possible and transferring it to parks, focusing on the highest value properties and thinking of new strategies to try to protect these properties in the future as sea levels rise in particular. Then we also have recommendations that are geared towards policies, changing policies that it can be difficult to do in New York, but we're at a time where where I think we're particularly ripe for that kind of change. Some examples are ways in which we can incentivize using green infrastructure, stormwater green infrastructure, low impact design to really improve the health of our landscapes, which is going to improve the health of our wetlands and habitat, and design for climate resilience so that we're no longer doing things like the photo shows here, building roads through wetlands, and then when we have to address those issues of resiliency, that we do it in sensitive ways to be sure to protect and improve ecological connections while we're doing it. We also need to improve regulatory protections. That's a big challenge in the city and across the state, and we're working with partners across the state to hopefully improve wetland maps, update wetland maps, and increase protections to wetland buffers. We also want to, and in New York in particular, small wetlands that can be particularly vulnerable on private property. And then finally, we want to continue to monitor and enforce mitigation when it happens. Wetland mitigation is inevitable, but there's a lot of mechanisms that we can use to improve the outcomes. So with that, I'm going to just reiterate that the goals of the framework that Sarah mentioned at the outset are really to protect our wetlands into the future for posterity. So we want to prevent wetland loss. We want to create new wetlands in the face, particularly of climate change and impacts. We want to improve the health of our wetland systems and think of them as connected in a watershed context, and do all the coordination and communication that we need in order to make that happen. We want to make sure that wetland restoration and management and stewardship is funded. It's a big goal and an important priority. And then we also need to, as I mentioned, expand the tools that we have in policy to protect and conserve both our existing wetlands and make sure that planning for the future incorporates and protects those habitats. So with that, hand it back to the group.
Great. That was really terrific. Thank you, Marit. Thank you, Sarah. I'm beginning to see questions in the Q&A, and I hope that many of you who are watching, and I took the opportunity to look through the list of folks, and hello everyone who's there. I love seeing all your names. Ask away. I know you have questions and questions about wetlands. So I wanted to start with a question to Mike and bring you into the conversation as a naturalist, and really the naturalist most familiar with New York City's green spaces and natural areas. I don't know anyone that knows them better than you do, and how wildlife use these spaces and birds in particular, and what you're thinking, what your biggest concerns are at this stage, thinking about wetland restoration, what our challenges are, and what birds need.
So before thinking about needs, I wanted to bring up a couple of very important anniversaries to get historical. I'm old enough to get historical. 49th anniversary today. Does anybody know? Very important 49th anniversary, October 27th, 1972.
Oh, is it Watergate?
Creation of Gateway National Recreation Area was October 22nd, 1972. Tremendous, taking everything south of the Belt Parkway, north of Rockaway, and putting it into Park Service jurisdiction, almost to the day. This is now 30th anniversary of salt marsh restoration in New York City. So that began 1991, October. Carl Alderson and I went out in a boat into Main Creek to collect Spartina, to grow it for the first time, to begin salt marsh restoration after the 1990 Exxon oil spill. So just thinking about two very positive historical precedents and wetlands, and to celebrate. It's still fairly short amount of time that we've been that conscious of wetlands. So I was glad that Marit brought up, in terms of a critical focus, is there will be development, there will be conflicts, there will be required mitigation. And the mitigation that happens sometimes doesn't have the outcome that we want it to. So remembering that there are state wetland regulations, designation of properties as wetlands is not protection, it's regulation. And so there are activities that are permitted, that continue to destroy wetlands. There's the framework for requiring mitigation to offset, but very often that the outcomes are not what we would hope they would. So for me, that's an important thing to keep in mind, and that sometimes takes the partnership of the public groups, the private nonprofits, because it's sometimes more awkward for some governmental agencies to hold the state's feet to the fire without the help also of the public. So that's one of the issues that loom large for me and have loomed large for me the past 40 years.
So I guess that's really the advocacy piece, and it comes from people, our members of the Natural Areas Conservancy, members of the Trust for Public Land, people who just get excited about what's happening down the block and, gee, I noticed something, who do I call? Getting excited, showing up for community board meetings, showing up for city council hearings and events when it is critical for people to have their voice heard. And I think about the ABN Advocates program that we've started in the past 2 years, which is encouraging people to be willing to receive messages from organizations like ours when we know there's a critical need, whether it's a hearing or please call your city council person and ask for whatever it might be. Those things are really important, and I don't think there's any substitute for people's voices being heard, except sometimes, even legal action is required, and that takes resources to do, and not just the will to do it, but the resources to do it. And there's a really great network of nonprofit environmental organizations in New York City that we really do, that talks to one another. And I've had a number of events in the past month where I've seen all three of you, and it's some of them even now in person again. And I think the environmental community really needs to embrace the partnership and the sharing that has to happen. And so again, part of tonight, the impetus for tonight was my desire for all of New York City Audubon's members to know about the Natural Areas Conservancy and its work and to support it. But also to know about the really amazing work that New York City Parks is doing to protect habitat right here in our city. It isn't just the federal government's problem or the state's problem, but it's our problem. I think about what is the thing that, Sarah, that you find to be the greatest challenge to getting the word out about these habitats and these wetland areas and their importance?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I guess before I answer, I just want to commend, I think New York City Audubon and you, Catherine, have done such an incredible job raising awareness and creating a really big tent approach to bringing diverse community voices together around these topics. I think one of the challenges is sort of the interplay between the hyper-local and this sort of opportunity / need for stronger regulation and leadership. So I think we've seen a lot of positive change in this field, but most individual wetland developments are most impactful for the immediate residents and sort of park users or lovers of that specific wetland. And one of the challenges that we face for the Natural Areas Conservancy, and I think you share this challenge, is creating kind of a shared identity and sense of urgency between the individual experiences and individual initiatives of community groups who maybe see themselves as neighborhood advocacy groups rather than wetland or habitat advocacy entities. I think the sort of coalition of partners that you're describing, working closely with government and working closely with agencies, has made a lot of strides in terms of creating both more visibility and more of a shared identity around these issues. But as Marit mentioned in her presentation, there's also some real opportunities to strengthen local regulations and protections on the books, especially for small wetlands and also for freshwater wetlands within the city, so that those advocacy efforts are supported by or interplay in a meaningful way with protections that really can be brought into play when there's a decision being made about whether a development project, for example, can go forward. So I think, yeah, it's kind of knowing how to move on these multiple fronts effectively and at the same time that I think is a huge challenge paired with this really local identity. I also do think there's a lot of opportunity in a positive way for the new mayor, new city council, kind of increased leadership on these topics. We certainly see both the reach of impact of big storm events and of the devastation of development on individual kind of community experiences, and I think an increased awareness both in New York City and nationally of the sort of the interconnectedness of our built and natural environments.
So that's really the interconnectedness of our built and natural environments. You know, we're a mega city. We're New York City. We're big. We're trying to be the best at everything. We like to pride ourselves on that. And when I think about the wetlands and the salt marshes and freshwater wetlands, and I think about Van Cortlandt Park and its wetland areas, and which I get to more than I can get to, say, based on where I live. You know, there are different wetlands in different boroughs, but all worthy of protection. You know, how do we help people who don't appreciate wetlands know a little bit more about them? That's one of the things I think about in terms of how we write about them, how we get people to wetlands and to see wetlands and to see wildlife in wetlands, because the birds they're going to see in those spaces are going to make them more embracing of that particular type of habitat, rather than, gosh, can't you just fill that in? And which is not the response I want. And I'm also eager to hear from Marit. You know, I think about the on the ground actions that you're looking at, which are the easiest to do and which are the hardest to do and which are the most important to do. Throw that one out there.
Well, I think in some ways the easiest on the ground actions can be pretty hard too in New York City. That, you know, for example, some of the easiest physical actions that can be quite satisfying to do with a community group. As a stewardship event, we do floatable marine debris pickup. That can be really satisfying if you sort of catch the tide on the right day. On the other hand, it's also can be considered a Sisyphean task, because you've got more marine debris that comes in again. But there are sources of marine debris. Obviously, you get into really complex systems of waste and our disposable, our culture of disposing trash and things like that. But that can be a satisfying activity. There are some invasive plants that you can manage, or increased habitat diversity that you can manage successfully with a really targeted dedicated community group in a particular location. So they're depending on the site and depending on the type of problem, large boats can really be removed successfely, and then you really accomplish something. But there are so many more difficult challenges that they're hard to enumerate. I think one of the simple ones, so I'll say one more again, is fill removal. We, especially, I think, Mike knows, was around for a lot of really significant, landfill restoration projects. The last one that he once told me, I'm doing this one and then I'm retiring, was at Garrettson Creek and the Marine Park. Really big areas that they were difficult and expensive, but in some ways we kind of view them now as like the low-hanging fruit. We can't just go in anymore and sort of remove former landfill and restore wetlands, because we've done a lot of that. So now it's the challenging task of trying to maintain the wetlands that we have. We're piloting things like applying thin sediment layers to help maintain that marsh plain elevation in the face of sea level rise. We're losing acres of wetland a year. I'm sure many of your listeners know about the loss of Jamaica Bay Islands and the big efforts to build back those islands. That's happening along our entire coast. We're losing, feet a year, which amounts to, acres a year. It's really difficult to sort of know where we're going to put our effort to protect which mile of wetland and shoreline. And we do have to choose and prioritize and kind of envision what do we want to have in 50 years, because we're not going to have everything. So
yeah, that's actually hard to hear in a way, but also it's encouraging, because I think that some people wonder, well, is nobody's doing anything, or I don't see it happening, but I really, the framework shows us that there is really a lot of thought behind what the city is trying to do to protect these wetlands. So Mike, can you talk a little bit about some of the birds that are benefiting most, and maybe one or two of your, I don't want to say preferred wetlands, favorite wetland areas in the city that are come to mind for you, when you about what you want to protect the most?
Birds benefiting most from current efforts.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure about that. Some that need help, like the salt marsh, I still call it a sharp-tailed sparrow. I learned birds in the 1970s, so people have to excuse salt marsh sparrow, Nelson sparrow. It's a sharp-tailed sparrow to me, and seaside sparrow. Thinking about four sparrow marsh, named by Ron Bork in the late 70s, where we have seen fewer of these birds, despite the fact that we're doing restoration, making marshes bigger. There's still, as far as I know, not a clear understanding of why the numbers are diminishing. So those birds should be, and maybe they are benefit from the restoration and preservation. Maybe they would have reduced far more if these efforts hadn't been underway. But so the area sensitive species in the marshes, like the seaside sparrow, the salt marsh sparrow, sharp-tailed sparrow, clapper rail, willet, those are often our target birds to, we're thinking of when we do the restoration, and we're thinking of hoping to see a signal after the restoration that the breeding doesn't diminish, and hopefully the breeding numbers go up. Something that we've seen in, since the 70s, coincidentally with October 1972 and the creation of Gateway, that's about the same year that we saw herons and egrets come back to New York City. They really were scarce or absent until about 1972. So the great iconic great egret, snowy egret, now much more common is yellow-crowned night heron, which was a southern bird. And so whether that's our efforts, Clean Water Act, global warming, multi-factors that Yellow-crowned night herons have been coming back into the marshes. Black-crowned night heron, always a favorite. Perhaps my favorite because it's like a Brooklyn street corner character, a little bit thuggish. And the green heron, all of these birds that we hope to see in the marsh, and that we hope that efforts are doing well for them.
Well, I want to take a couple questions from the Q&A. There's a question here about Phragmites. Which one of you would like to tackle Phragmites? Are Phragmites invasive? Phragmites going to be removed? What are we going to do about Phragmites? And what else is invasive, maybe that isn't as fun to say, but that gives you angst?
I'll speak to Phragmites. I think some of you probably know that Judith Weiss and Eric Ziviat, there are a couple of regional ecologists that are big proponents of not removing or not focusing on Phragmites removal. And I'd say that our perspective on Phragmites has changed. The giant reed that I remember, when I went to college, first hearing about was taking over the Northeast. We're no longer looking at just a plant and saying, oh, that's bad, let's get that out of here. It's monoculture, which is not great generally, but on the other hand, salt marshes are not have one species largely in the low marsh. So we're not looking at it and saying we need to get rid of that and let's get in here and build something else. We're looking at why is the Phragmites there. So if we've got Phragmites on a relatively recent fill from the last 50 years that was on a salt marsh, we say, oh, that might be an opportunity for Phragmites removal, excavation, reestablishing the hydrology and the functions of a salt marsh. If we've got an excessive, poor quality soil, excessive pollution or nutrient loads, and it's something that we can actually tackle and change, then we say, oh, let's address that problem and then remove the Phragmites and reestablish a wetland condition we want to have. But if we make the effort to reestablish a more diverse lake or freshwater shoreline, we don't want Phragmites to come in and take it over, because that means we haven't invested in caring for the native species that we installed. But there are large areas that we are not focusing on, where we're not focusing on removing Phragmites, and Alley Creek is actually a great example of it, where you've just got that brackish condition where the very unconsolidated sediment in kind of an estuarine area where we could throw tens of millions of dollars at that site and still have Phragmites in the end. So it really depends on what's causing the problem, where the problem arises, how did the landscape get to that condition, and that's one comment about Phragmites. Pass it on.
Okay, let's see. Anyone else want to take on Phragmites or invasives or that topic? Is there something that keeps you up at night, Mike, about invasive species?
No, I think just maybe to build a little bit more on what Marit said, it's very complicated and you have to pick your battles. So I don't think anybody's under the notion that it can be eradicated or should be eradicated. But since the forum is Audubon, I've already begun with birds and the sparrows, the area sensitive. If you have the opportunity to increase low salt marsh, high marsh at the expense of Phragmites, you have the opportunity of maybe doing something that benefits willet and salt marsh sparrow. And then understanding that the potential conflict is you're going to possibly see fewer marsh wrens.
Mm-hmm.
So, you see fewer red-winged blackbirds. I'm not sure in the scheme of things, that becomes part of the decision making. It's functional, and what are the costs and the benefits, knowing that that whatever you plan to do is going to be costly. So there better be clear, measurable benefits, or at least a good potential for those benefits.
Yeah. Now there's a question in the Q&A and chat about the interconnectedness of wetlands and green spaces, and thinking about, I like to say what's good for birds is good for people, or what's good for people is good for birds. Clean air, clean water, clean land. This is what makes the world a better place for all living beings, of which we are one. And the question is really about mental health having been mentioned as an ecosystem service. And I, I think about artificial light and the fight that we're mounting against light pollution, which is also something that has a real effect on mental health of people. Can you speak a little bit to how you're approaching this topic in terms of people and their health, and how you spread that word? I mean, it's really about, this person, the question is thinking, how do we quantify this? But really, how do we show leaders how truly important this concept is, that it's about all of our health?
I can kick us off with a sort of initial response. So actually, maybe starting with a little quantitative data about this topic. We worked closely with the US Forest Service in 2013 and 2014 and conducted a citywide social assessment that was sort of a companion study to the citywide ecological assessment that featured in the sort of data in the graph that Marit showed about prioritization of wetlands. In the social research that we conducted, a couple of really interesting findings emerged. We talked to people in more than 40 parks across the 5 boroughs in both forest and wetland areas. 50% of those people said that city parks were the only place where they experienced nature, which was really startling for us, and really has been kind of a finding that's guided a lot of our thinking about the importance of natural area parkland as a key right for New Yorkers. The idea that half of the people who live in our city are not leaving the city to experience nature in a state park or in a national park outside of the 5 boroughs really highlights the importance of making the natural areas that exist within our city accessible. About a third of the people who responded to that survey listed mental health, peace, quiet, opportunities for reflection as their #1 reason for spending time in natural areas, which really highlighted for us. And I mean, the quotes are like really beautiful about the individual relationships that people have with these park spaces, and that they've developed over, sometimes decades of daily or weekly visits to these parks, the way that it features into their daily routine. And then a third stat that also supports this: during the summer of 2020, we went out and reassessed social use in natural areas across both forests and wetlands. And in the parks where we conducted interviews, there was a 65% increase in visitation due to the pandemic. And I think it really highlighted the way in which both the stress of the pandemic and the lockdown that we were under at that time was really giving people this opportunity to turn towards parks generally, but specifically to natural spaces within parks, because they offer both space to spread out, space to be alone or to recreate in small groups. And many, many people talked about the value of spending time someplace beautiful and someplace that gave them a source of inspiration during a really trying period. So that, I think mix of quantitative information about the number of people using these spaces and the qualitative feedback about just the profound impact that spending time in these places has really both motivated our work, but also given us a lot of really rich information to take to our elected officials and weave into our advocacy efforts.
Yeah. You know, and I that's it really brings home the importance of having natural areas in cities, which are full of people who are not necessarily leaving, especially in the pandemic. This is where they experience nature, and you want what they experience to be beautiful and natural, and in walking distance from their home. And another really important feature. Before I see we're getting up on 7:55, and I do want to talk a little bit about that topic of natural areas in walking distance to home. And New York City Audubon has produced its Birding by Subway piece, which is trying to get people, at least by public transit, to many of the corners of the city, including Staten Island, which has some really incredible habitat, from Mount Loretto to Great Kills to Clay Pit Ponds and Fresh Kills, which is the topic of our talk on November 8th, and the grasshopper sparrows and the sedge wrens and the other birds that are coming there because it's been built. And I think the same thing has happened at Shirley Chisholm State Park. How do we make people experience wetlands in the way they're now experiencing those grasslands, albeit man-made grasslands? What can we do to make these spaces accessible and used, but not trod upon? And maybe Sarah, you could talk a little bit about the efforts to create trails and paths. And
I would love to. So we've been working closely with the Parks Department for about 5 years now to systematically improve public access to the 10,000 acres of natural areas on City Parks property. At this point, we've set a goal of formalizing the trail system, which is over 300 miles of trails within the next 3 years. There's, I'll say, lots of opportunities to become involved in a volunteer capacity or to participate in one of the walks. And I think I really view this as a parks equity issue. I think there's been a big focus with regards to parks equity on the creation of new parkland, which is critically important, especially in neighborhoods that don't have green space and playgrounds. But we also have a tremendous opportunity, in my opinion, to really re-invite the public into our natural areas in a way that is appropriate for the sensitivity of those places. And in many parks, our efforts are really focused on actually streamlining and reducing the number of total trails within natural areas. And this is definitely true for wetlands in particular. So giving people less options, but having those options be really well cared for and well signed and highly accessible provides a huge benefit in terms of habitat by reducing human impact in an unplanned way across large areas, while simultaneously providing really high quality and important opportunities for visitation and recreation to parks all across the city.
Mike, are there any wetlands that are maybe outside of the Parks Department's purview, or that are worthy of our attention and that we should be really looking at and thinking about from an advocacy perspective and a community perspective?
Places like Flushing Airport, perhaps. The biggest.
Tell us about that. Where is that? What is that?
The biggest freshish, brackish, but mostly freshwater wetland that hardly anybody knows about, between Flushing Meadows Park and College Point, former float airplane municipal airfield, that's been underwater. That is also an example of one of these maybe mitigation outcomes that were less than desirable. In the middle of College Point Industrial Park, a lot of city interest for various development. With the development came other wetland destruction, and the core of this Flushing Airport was supposed to be focus of some of the sort of cumulative mitigation for some of the cumulative impacts. Right now, from what I understand, it's under the jurisdiction of the Small Business Administration, the city's small business services. So something to continue looking at, something to continue advocating for. That's the big one. They're a little, I think Marit showed in the map, there's still some in that big wetland complex that was one of the major harbor heron complexes on Staten Island, in the vicinity of Meredith Woods, and you had a graphic that showed some properties that remain.
The Francesco property.
Oh, what? That's the one with butter and lemon. Is that what makes that a? But there are and Parks and NAC, I'm sure have them all mapped out, and I've been looking carefully at them.
Yeah.
Except maybe for Flushing Airport, but we can invite them if we ever get to go.
Yeah. That's an interesting one because it's actually a big parcel, and I don't know if many people really realize that that's not city land, green space land. What's really going on there, and would be very surprised and perhaps disturbed if suddenly that became drained and developed in some way. I think that is worthy of keeping our eye on. We do have a question in the Q&A about managed retreat. Would you like to, Marit, would you like to explain what managed retreat is? And this is thinking about wetland restoration and results that fall short of expectations. How often is managed retreat discussed or considered when you're addressing policies or courses of action?
Well, managed retreat is, I don't know who coined the term, but it is describes the process of intentionally removing development, removing houses, a process that happened after Sandy. There were buyouts of homes that were damaged when the homeowners were willing to sell. And so it's a pulling back from the frequently inundated areas, pulling back from coastal wetlands, from tidal areas, and because tides are rising and there are new low-lying lands that are becoming frequently inundated. You might have heard of the sunny weather flooding in coastal areas. That's just the tide pushing in. So intentionally moving out of those areas. So it's definitely something that has in the past been very politically charged, and it's certainly a very challenging subject for a lot of reasons, because it involves complex community histories that are tied to differences and economic status and privileged and power dynamics, but it's increasingly, I would say, accepted as something that we need to consider in the right places, in places where, especially where communities are want to see it happen. So the kind of simple examples, relatively speaking, in New York City are where the state and federal funding assisted with buyouts And one of those examples is in the Howard Beach area and Ramblersville in particular, where there were numerous, I think about 10 or 12, I might be getting this wrong, neighbors who were willing to participate in the buyouts. Many of you know the Staten Island sites as well in Oakwood Beach, and were then, the houses were then demolished and wetlands are essentially allowed to come back in. And so I think the Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency in particular is looking really kind of starting a process to look at that as a policy option. It's sort of de facto what has happened in a couple of areas, but it's far from being something that is clear and accepted across the city in neighborhoods where it physically could be considered.
Yeah, well, I think of people who are trying to raise things up and build out over, it's a challenging thing. Well, we're just after 8 o'clock, so I'm going to wrap things up. But I want to thank you all for joining us and for sharing your wisdom. The Natural Areas Conservancy is just an amazing organization that has emerged in the past 10 years, and next year we'll be celebrating its 10th anniversary. Very exciting. New York City Parks and its chiefs, whether they are sort of retired or still there, are really in the natural resources group and in the teams that you have that are doing this work and are tirelessly toiling for and advocating for from within the natural areas, which are different from hard landscape parks. They're natural areas, they're buffer zones, and they're really important for wildlife, and they're really important for birds. And I'm just so grateful for all the work that you're doing, and Mike, for keeping your eye on this and helping to keep our conservation committee focused on the importance of these spaces. So with that, I think we've got our questions, and we look forward to seeing many people on November 8th to talk about fresh kills, and Jose Ramirez Garofalo and Shannon Curley will be presenting about the birds of fresh kills and what's happening there. So good night, everyone, and thank you so much.
Thanks. It's a pleasure.